Good morning, West and the world. Welcome to your review video for Tuesday, December the 10th, following this morning's lecture on the end of the Cold War. Today we returned to the story that we began last Tuesday when we began to discuss this Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that defines so much of the 20th century. When we left it off, we had been talking about the buildup of nuclear armaments, the arsenals of these two states, and how that shaped this into a very anxious, although oddly stable, period in world history. Today we began our class with some discussion about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the ways in which this marks a shift from an era in the 1950s of sort of what I called ideological purity, where both sides were deeply committed to their respective ideologies, to an era after the Cuban Missile Crisis in which both sides began to sort of compromise or look for sort of alternatives. Their approaches become more realist rather than based profoundly in ideology. Of course, the effects of this period we said were sort of unsettling at a social level, and so we talked a little bit about the emergence of hippie culture or the counterculture, the movements of the women's rights movement, their struggle for equal opportunity for women, and how this plays itself out in a kind of questioning attitude, a time of general social instability, particularly when you consider the Western response to the Vietnam War and similar kinds of struggles. And then we shifted our attention to the question of the Eastern Bloc and what is happening that ultimately sort of brings the Cold War to a close. We said that there are hints of this as early as 1968, when the Prague Spring has to be violently crushed by the Soviet Union. In the end, the Soviet Union, we said, is undone by an economic depression, its own messy war in Afghanistan, increased unrest expressed by solidarity and other kinds of labor movements that spring up in the Eastern Bloc countries, and, of course, by a shift in leadership, a fundamental shift that unfolds over the course of the early 80s as the old guard passes away and men like Mikhail Gorbachev become incredibly influential. Gorbachev, of course, makes key decisions, especially the introduction of glasnost, that notion of intellectual openness, and perestroika, the economic reforms that eventually, although unintentionally, lead to the collapse of not just the Soviet Union, but the entire Warsaw Pact bloc, and the end of communist rule in the Eastern European sphere. This is a major shift, and one that had been largely unforeseen. Very few people expected the Cold War to be over by the end of the 1980s. The end of this great ideological struggle, political struggle, social struggle, means that new questions emerge. What will be the shape of the world when it has been so profoundly shaped by these two competing forces? That question will be the central theme as we conclude our class together on Thursday. See you then.